Mr. Speaker, thank you. The return of hostages and the end of daily massacres of civilians is profoundly to be welcomed. And while the Foreign Secretary has attributed much of the work to diplomats, it's obvious that whatever you think about him, by all reports, the critical intervention has been that of President-elect Trump. And while he has issued public threats to Hamas, he's quite obviously, again by all reports, outlined a series of consequences and accountabilities to the Israeli government. So as we look towards the worsening situation in the West Bank, is there a lesson here, Madam Deputy Speaker, for British foreign policy in this regard? That, as many of us in this House have urged over the last 14 months, talking does not work.
Obviously, we hope that the Israeli cabinet makes a rapid decision to support this ceasefire agreement. But a ceasefire agreement is only a ceasefire, and one hopes it's going to be rapidly followed by the release of all of the hostages and of the prisoners as been agreed. However, there have been some major developments over the past 2 years, particularly on the legal front, where the International Court of Justice has recognised acts of a genocidal nature have taken place and also called for Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and an end to the settlement policy. Will the Foreign Secretary commit the British government to demanding that all of the ICJ recommendations are carried out and that Israel does have a programme of withdrawal from the West Bank and an end to the settlement policy?
Last November, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for crimes against humanity and war crimes, including targeting civilians and using starvation as a weapon of war. The British public deserve clarity, so I'll ask again. Will the Foreign Secretary confirm that should Benjamin Netanyahu step on British soil, he would be immediately arrested, yes or no?
Last night, US President Biden and Qatari Prime Minister Al Thani confirmed that negotiators had reached an agreement. While we await political approval for the text, the agreement is expected to come into force shortly after midday, Israel time, on Sunday, the 19th of January. After months of despair, there is now hope. A glimmer of light in the darkness, a darkness that had seemed all-consuming since Hamas' barbaric attack on the 7th of October 2023. I'm sure the whole House remembers the agony as we learned the full horror of what had unfolded, the grief as we mourned those that were lost. For the hostage families, the agony has gone on and on. Members across the House will have met many of them, including the relatives of British citizen Emily Damari, and L.A. Sharabi, and Odeed Leshef, and Avatan Orr. And I know we have families with us here in the chamber today. I want to pay tribute once again to them for their bravery, humanity and commitment to bring the hostages home. And I invite the House to remember those murdered in captivity, including Nadav Popperwell and Yossi Sharabi. May their memories be a blessing. And I say to all those now waiting anxiously to see what this deal means for them, we are with you in the days and weeks ahead. Madam Deputy Speaker, in Gaza today, civilians will be waiting anxiously to see what this deal means for them. And I say to them too, we are with you as you begin to rebuild your lives. After 15 months of conflict, the level of suffering defies belief. Gazans have truly been trapped in hell on earth. Over 46,000 killed. So many children's lives extinguished, schools, hospitals and homes destroyed, hunger and disease, almost 2 million forced to flee their homes, with northern Gaza cut off from the rest of the Strip, a generation scarred by the savagery of war. Among the victims was Hind Rajab, a 5-year-old Palestinian girl killed alongside members of her family and the paramedics who came to rescue her. Among the victims were many journalists dedicated to documenting the horrors around them, Among the victims were aid workers dedicated to serving others, including British citizens John Chapman, James Henderson, and James Kirby. I invite the House to join me in remembering them all. We mourn every innocent victim of this appalling war. Beyond Israel and Gaza, this conflict has brought yet more tensions and conflict into the wider region. Unprecedented Iranian attacks, a renewed conflict in Lebanon, Houthi strikes in the Red Sea and into Israel. At times, too, our own communities, indeed this House, have been divided by this war. This, then, is a moment of hope for all of us, a moment to unite in support of this ceasefire. The agreement as negotiated, Madam Deputy Speaker, has 3 stages. In the first 6-week phase, we expect both parties to stop fighting. 33 of the hostages will be freed: children, women, those over 50, and the wounded. Israel will start to redeploy to the edge of the Strip. Palestinians will return to what is left of their homes. The Rafah crossing will reopen. Israel will allow 600 truckloads of aid into Gaza each day. And on the 16th day, negotiations will begin on the detail of the second phase. In this second 6-week phase, the male hostages under 50 would be released. Israel would complete its withdrawal from Gaza, and there would be a permanent ceasefire. Finally, a third phase would see the return of the bodies of any remaining hostages and the lifting of economic restrictions on Gaza. As President Biden said, the elements of this deal were endorsed by the United Nations Security Council last May, but it has taken tireless efforts to reach agreement between both sides, with reports of final talks this week lasting an intense 96 hours. I congratulate all those who have contributed to getting to this stage. In particular, His Highness the Emir of Qatar, the Prime Minister Al Thani, Egyptian President Sisi and Foreign Minister al-Badati, President Biden and Secretary Blinken, as well, of course, as President-elect Trump. The UK has been supporting them throughout. From day one in office, the government has pressed at every stage for an immediate ceasefire, to free the hostages, get more aid into Gaza, and open up a path to a lasting peace. I visited Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories for the 3rd time as Foreign Secretary just this week, meeting Foreign Minister Saar, President Abbas, and hostage families to press for an end to this war and a plan for the future. We have also played a leading role in the humanitarian effort, restarting funding to UNRWA, funding field hospitals that have treated over 300,000 Gazas, and providing over 100 million in support to the Palestinians this financial year. I pay tribute too to the Foreign Office ministers in the last government for their work to deliver aid to Gaza. I know how hard they work now I'm in this role. And this intense effort must continue in the days and weeks ahead. Much remains to be done. It is critical that there is final approval of this agreement, and the Israeli cabinet meets. As the Israeli cabinet meets, I urge them to back this deal. Now is not the time for any backtracking. Both sides must implement each phase of the deal in full and on time. The history of this conflict is littered with missed opportunities. It would be a tragedy to let slip the chance before us. We must grab it with both hands, the chance not just for a ceasefire, but for a lasting peace. The chance to break the cycle of violence which has inflicted so much suffering on innocent people on both sides. The government is committed to sustaining momentum, however fragile the process at first may be. Every hostage must be released, as set out in the agreement. Every ounce of aid promised to Gaza must reach those in need. I'm sending my representative for humanitarian affairs to the region to work closely with aid agencies, the Israeli government and our partners to deliver on these promises. Palestinians must also be free to return to their homes, and crucially, they will need to rebuild. Rebuild their homes, rebuild their lives, rebuild their communities. They can't do this possibly on their own. They need to feel safe. They need the international community to deliver the funds that they will require. The UK has already begun to convene partners on the financing and coordination of recovery and reconstruction. It's essential that the coming surge of assistance is properly coordinated and with the access and security to get people all that they need. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Palestinian Authority has a crucial role to play. We want donors to support their plans for recovery, and I discussed this with President Abbas on Monday. We are providing technical and financial assistance to the PA, including to support the urgent recovery of basic services. Working with the Palestinian Authority and civil society will help lay the groundwork for an inclusive Palestinian governance in Gaza. This is the best way to re-establish local order and security, and it is therefore a crucial first step in achieving not only better lives for Palestinians, but a future for Gaza no longer under the control of Hamas. Ultimately, it will take time to rebuild Gaza and rebuild trust between the two sides. There are risks, I must warn the House, at every turn. But we must try to use this agreement to establish a credible pathway to a two-state solution. Yeah. With equal measures of security, dignity and justice for Israelis and Palestinians alike. The decades-long conflict between Israelis and Palestinians cannot be managed. It must now be resolved. Madam Deputy Speaker, we're not yet there. There's much negotiating still to do. And as we debate in this House, fighting continues. This agreement awaits full political approval. The hostage families wait for those hostages to come home. Gazans wait for the horrors to be lifted. But we must still recognise the significance of this moment. It has been long awaited, frankly. It has taken far too long. And I sincerely hope it is now the basis for progress. Progress on bringing the hostages home, progress on bringing relief, reconstruction, and hope to long-suffering civilians, progress towards a two-state solution with Palestinians and Israelis living in peace and security, a better future for all. I commend this statement to the House.
Maltese.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. The return of hostages and the end of daily massacres of civilians is profoundly to be welcomed. And while the Foreign Secretary has attributed much of the work to diplomats, it's obvious that whatever you think about him, by all reports, the critical intervention has been that of President-elect Trump. And while he has issued public threats to Hamas, he's quite obviously, again by all reports, outlined a series of consequences and accountabilities to the Israeli government. So as we look towards the worsening situation in the West Bank, is there a lesson here, Madam Deputy Speaker, for British foreign policy in this regard? That, as many of us in this House have urged over the last 14 months, talking does not work. And unless it is followed up with sure and certain consequence and accountability, whether that's bilateral or indeed through international institutions, there will be no movement.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman, too, I know, follows these issues very closely and sometimes been a lone voice on his own side on these issues. And he will know that the UK government under us has had to take bilateral decisions that have been very difficult ones because of our concerns about breaches of international humanitarian law. My own reflections are that this has been, in some ways, the most challenging of political environments for this conflict, partly because there was an election in the United States for much of 2024. And had we been able to achieve a more bipartisan approach sooner, we might have seen the pressure that was necessary to bring both parties to the deal that we have finally reached. But I'm very pleased that the President-elect's envoy was able to work with Joe Biden's envoy and actually bring this thing over the line. But it's fragile, and I await the decision that will necessarily come from the Israeli Security Cabinet at this time.
Paul Wall.
Can I thank the Foreign Secretary and the Development Minister and the Middle East Minister for all the hard work they've done, both in public and in private, to secure today's attempt at a ceasefire, and also to bring the hostages home and get as much humanitarian aid in as possible. But can I raise Tom Fletcher, the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, his remarks where he said today, this deal could have been done a year ago. And the ferocity of the killing by Israel and Hamas has been, and I quote, a 21st century atrocity. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that there will only be lasting peace in the Middle East if the Israeli government and the international community both treat all lives as equal, and that a Palestinian's child's life is as equal as that as an Israeli's?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for the work that he's done both before coming to this place and, of course, within the context of his new constituency on these issues. Thank you very much for bringing to mind the role of my dear colleagues for development and on the Middle East. But let me thank also previous colleagues with those portfolios and indeed shadow colleagues with those portfolios. Many of us have played a part to ensure that we get to this end, and he's right too that there will be time for a lot of reflection on how we got here and why we got here. But I think the critical thing for me at this moment is that this ceasefire holds, that we get beyond the first phase to the second phase, that we get to the third phase, and the third phase, it seems to me, can only hold if we have a political process. That is the attention that I must pay to actually bring about a lasting peace.
Thank you,
Madam Deputy Speaker. Israel denied that it was holding Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, the director of Kamal Adwan Hospital, only to confirm that it had in fact detained him. There are reports that he is currently being tortured in prison. The Foreign Secretary mentioned earlier today in his statement that the history of this conflict is littered with missed opportunities. Can he take the opportunity today to clearly condemn the conduct of Israel's indefinite mass incommunicado detention of Palestinians en masse without charge or trial, and what action is the government taking in light of the ceasefire offer on the table on its close allies' pattern of deadly attacks on healthcare, which are clearly part of an intention to destroy and degrade Palestinians as a group?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady that we have raised these issues with the Israeli government and through the Christmas period, and at this time we recognise that there is pain, we recognise there is concerns about international humanitarian law, but all of us have a responsibility in this House to do all we can to bridge the divides if we are to ensure that this deal holds and the people of Gaza get the respite that I know that she has been campaigning for many, many months indeed.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Obviously, we hope that the Israeli Cabinet makes a rapid decision to support this ceasefire agreement. But a ceasefire agreement is only a ceasefire, and one hopes it's going to be rapidly followed by the release of all of the hostages and of the prisoners as been agreed. However, There have been some major developments over the past 2 years, particularly on the legal front, where the International Court of Justice has recognised acts of a genocidal nature have taken place and also called for Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and an end to the settlement policy. Will the Foreign Secretary commit the British government to demanding that all of the ICJ recommendations are carried out and that Israel does have a programme of withdrawal from the West Bank and an end to the settlement policy? There cannot be any peace for the Palestinian people whilst they remain under occupation. They've suffered so much, they've lost so much, they've lost so many, and the mental scars of the people of Gaza are now going to be intergenerational. They're going to need a lot of support to get through this, and above all, international recognition of the state of Palestine.
Well, let me begin by recognising the unique way in which the Honourable Gentleman has raised these issues in this House over a lifetime of work, and his commitment to justice and accountability in this particular era. It is right and proper that international humanitarian law is followed, and it is right and proper that the international courts do their work. And let me also be clear that this government does not believe in illegal occupation, that this government is committed to two states. And let me repeat again, we cannot tolerate the violence. We cannot tolerate the expansion. We recommit ourselves to continuing to work with civil society on the ground in the West Bank and the occupied territory who are documenting these things, and actually both governments have continued to support those organisations over many, many years. And clearly when we get to that settlement, it will essentially come down to swaps and very serious negotiation in terms of that land on both sides. We recognise that, and that's why expansion is so thoroughly unacceptable.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last November, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for crimes against humanity and war crimes, including targeting civilians and using starvation as a weapon of war. The British public deserve clarity, so I'll ask again. Will the Foreign Secretary confirm that should Benjamin Netanyahu step on British soil, he would be immediately arrested, yes or no?
Well, I say to the Honourable Lady, and I think this has been said before, we do have a legal process in this country were that to come to pass. And that is an important process. Ultimately, it will be a decision for our courts. And so it's important from this dispatch box that I leave that matter for them. But I have said in terms that we are a signatory to the Statute of Rome. Not just because we are, but because we believe in it. And therefore, as she would expect, this government will comply with the law if that were to come to pass.